Welcome everyone to Bellwether Enterprise's Multifamily Investor Symposium. We're going to take a first look at key issues impacting the multifamily investment industry with keynote speaker Don Layton, DJ Effler, President, Bellwether Enterprise, and Jeff Patton, National Director of Agency Relationships for Bellwether. Before we get started, I want to cover a few brief logistics. All attendee lines are muted. The call is being recorded. The recording will be made available after the call to all those that have registered, and you can post questions at any time during this call using the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. We will answer questions during the Q&A portion of this call, and when you submit a question, they will only be seen by the panelists. With that, I will turn the call over to our president, DJ Effler, and he will introduce our keynote speaker and get underway.
Thanks, Denise, and thanks to all of you for taking an hour or so out of your day to join us for our first Multifamily Investor Symposium. I'm DJ Effler, and I'll be hosting this discussion along with my partner, Jeff Patton. Jeff runs the agency finance group of Bellwether Enterprise and is a true pro in the space. He'll be vetting questions as they come in and will run the Q&A portion of the call. We intend on hosting sessions like this from time to time going forward when we have interesting content and industry information that we believe will be relevant to share to a broader audience. Today's discussion will focus on the extremely impactful topic in the multifamily investment space, the incoming Biden administration, and the potential impact the administrative change will have on Fannie and Freddie's potential exit of conservatorship. By far the dominant providers of non-recourse finance in the multifamily investment market, Fannie and Freddie, what Fannie and Freddie do, it really impacts what's going on and the value of all of our investments. One of my favorite statistics coincides with Fannie and Freddie's entrance into the conservatorship as the rise of their production volume in the multifamily market. In 2007, the agency's production volume was approximately $35 billion. Today, that number is close to $160 billion. Just think about the rise of value of your multifamily assets in the last 12 years. It's obvious that Fannie and Freddie's impact on that has been tremendous. And what they do in the market in terms of pricing and deal structure really drive the bus. Although none of us can predict the future, especially when politics are involved, what we intend to do today is bring you the perspective of someone extremely familiar with the inner workings of the agencies, who has lived through the administrative changes running Freddie Mac, and someone whose opinion is still solicited as policy is shaped today. It's as close to the seat at the table as most of us will ever get. Our guest today is Don Layton. To walk through Don's many accomplishments in his lifetime would eat up far too much of this time, so I'll keep it brief. A lifetime banker, Don began his career as a trainee at what is now JP Morgan Chase and ended up running it and retiring as vice chairman. He ran capital markets, he ran trading, and all of consumer finance. Don's definition of retirement is definitely different than most of our definition of retirement, though. Don was called to guide E-Trade through the financial crisis as chairman and CEO, shepherding it through its most challenging time in the market. A desire to serve and make the financial system more stable led Don to his next endeavor, which was CEO of Freddie Mac, a role which he immersed himself in from 2012 to 2019 when he made the decision to retire again. Today, Don spends the majority of his time pursuing his philanthropic endeavors, which revolve around one common theme: helping people. He's particularly passionate about initiatives helping the homeless and disadvantaged children. Lucky for us, his philanthropic orientation led him to our partner Enterprise, where he currently serves on the board. I should also mention that Don continues to get his policy kicks, not only with his involvement at Enterprise, but with the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard, where he serves as industry fellow. I don't think we could have brought too many people more relevant to this conversation. So a sincere thank you for joining us today. To Don, and Don, thank you so much for all you do at Bellwether Enterprise and on our board. The floor is yours.
Thank you, DJ. I'm very happy to meet all your clients, so many of your clients this way, and kind of get the gospel out of how things really work in Washington related to housing finance. It's kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. In contemplating this assignment, everyone, I sat back and thought about what is the main theme going on right now today. And that leads to the title of my talk. Slide, please, Christine. The title is The GSEs and Multifamily, A Time of Peak Uncertainty. Businesses love certainty for planning. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, you are at the opposite end of that spectrum. Because the GSEs are so tied in to government that all the change in administration in Washington with President Biden coming in, plus unrelated issues related to the leadership of the FHFA, leads to maximum uncertainty. And I'll go through that in some detail. And this will give you a framework to figure out maybe what to expect some. Next slide, please. As Jeff alluded to, quite honestly, there's a reminder of how much the GSEs are not just normal companies. They really represent the government outlet in some ways for housing finance. They're privately owned companies with a public mission. They're given advantages and restrictions to pursue it. In practical terms, they're kind of half government agencies and half for-profit corporations. Everything is politicized, but the role they play is government-sized. On the single-family side, which gets the most attention, over $5 trillion of outstanding guarantees on mortgages, meaning they own almost half of the single-family first mortgages in America. It's about 11 trillion outstanding now. They were doing about 45% of flow until the pandemic, and it's been over 60% since, as some private sources ran away. This is an astoundingly large size, makes them the largest privately owned financial institution in the country. Multifamily has about 7.7 trillion outstanding. And since about 2008, as DJ alluded, they've been doing about 40% of the new flow. It bounces around versus 25% back in the older days earlier. So this is not just a company, a competitor or two participating in the multifamily business. They play too big a role in it, and that puts them into the government policy realm of managing this. So what about the uncertainty? It's really hard to tell what's going to happen now. I have several dimensions of uncertainty. Let's go to the first one. Next slide, please. Okay. In conservatorship, which is an obscure status that I don't think anyone would have ever heard of until the GSEs were put in it, the FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the regulator of the GSEs and the home loan banks, is conservator, has total 100% control of the GSEs. In the legislation, this power carries with it all the rights of the shareholders, the board, and management. So we were totally subject to what they're doing. However, the FHFA, also unusual for a regulator, has a single director that has independence, what I put for cause independence. He can only be fired for cause, which is not well defined, by the President of the United States. Otherwise, they're independent. That's considered good for a regulator to have independence. But a single regulator, rather than a commissioner or a group like the Federal Reserve Board or the SEC, is unusual. This means this one person at the time, a political appointee confirmed by the Senate, can do kind of reasonably whatever they want with the GSEs. Mark Calabria is the current director. His term ends in 2024, but there is a SCOTUS stands for Supreme Court of the United States. There's a Supreme Court case called Collins v. Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, that puts his independence into question as being unconstitutional. I won't go into the whys there unless you're interested. The likely outcome is that he will lose his independence and be fireable for any reason, not just for cause, at the end when decisions are announced at the end of the Supreme Court term around June. That's a prediction. It's not 100%. I think it's likely, and that's what's expected broadly. He would then be replaced by President Biden with an acting, and then at some point later on, a Senate-confirmed permanent. So you might not get a new permanent head of the agency until late in the year. In the meantime, Director Calabria, we'll talk about this some, has embarked upon more micromanagement of the GSEs than they had under the prior directors. So you're starting to see leadership departures at the companies as basically management discretion has been taken away from them from what they expected. So they're moving on. How big or bad that could be, we don't know, but we know it started. Next slide, please. We have uncertainty about policy direction. The FHFA director, with all this power, comes into the position with a viewpoint, an ideological viewpoint, and then can proceed. Some of them have stated plainly, I'm putting my ideology aside and will be a nice neutral professional regulator, but they don't have to. So Director Calabria comes from the political right. He comes from a think tank and government service background, which is very pro-free market and believes the GSEs represent an unusually large and, in his view, regrettable intrusion of big government into the private financing markets. And he is seen broadly as increasingly ideological in his actions to shrink the footprint, that's the phrase used in Washington, of the GSEs as permanently as possible. He approved a capital rule that's generally regarded as way too high. I wrote a paper and had a title, Little Support and a Short Shelf Life. While industries always resist capital increases, this one went way past that. And my prediction would be the first time a Biden regulator gets in place, it will be revised to be more mainstream. He has a bizarre anti-credit risk transfer bias, which is very hard to figure out. He has installed a multifamily lending cap regime, which we will talk more about, that has started to become not just a new regime, but a shrink the footprint regime. Again, we'll talk more about that. And he's got other things coming in, liquidity rules that are asking for more liquidity, new product controls, so innovation will slow up at best, and maybe even canceling on the single family side the ability to purchase mortgages that are backed by second homes or investment properties. A small amount is done of that. But most importantly, even possibly eliminating cash out refinances. But this is all up in the air as he looks to do these things, as in if President Biden replaces him and the timing of that. So you just really don't know where this thing is going. Next slide, please. You have uncertainty about GSE conservatorship exit. First of all, there's the usual confusion of language. For most of the years since the GSEs have been in conservatorship, the talk of exit meant fully capitalize them to a new standard, and then they can leave. Director Calabria has put on the table a different definition, which I call nominal, whereas they leave without the capital and then they raise the capital. Since that is very odd, the conservatorship is replaced by what's called a consent decree. In other words, conservatorship kind of by another name. So it depends who you're talking to, what you mean when you're talking about the word exit. Prior to the election, presidential election, the image of GSE conservatorship exit in the media was that it was well on its way. I believe the reality is very different, and the surface has just been scratched with many years to come. That's largely because the matters related to raising capital, the surface hasn't been touched. This is mostly under the control of Treasury, and they have not focused on it. Since the election, you now have a lame duck period where you knew the administration was ending. That means Secretary Mnuchin's time is, the clock is ticking to next week. Director Calabria theoretically stays through this. During this time, Director Calabria is reported in the media to be pushing for all sorts of things to help GSEs exit conservatorship or to pursue his conservative ideological objectives. Secretary Mnuchin, who has to approve many of them, has not done so yet. But the rumor mill has been churning overtime. And I've learned in Washington, you get run around the room with all the different rumors. We've had everything from there'll be a conservatorship exit right now before Trump's term ends with a consent decree that no one's seen. You'll have another rumor that the shareholder lawsuits will be settled despite the case being already argued at the Supreme Court. You have rumors that the senior preferred, the government support, that is the most top level type of equity and blocks really any ability to raise equity until it's resolved, will be just waived as paid. You have all sorts of things, even including that Calabria will exit conservatorship without Treasury permission, even though it is specifically required in a legal document. It is Washington at its swampiest. You just have to learn how to look at these things with a very jaundiced eye. My estimate is it'll be less, not more, of what happens. And the latest rumors since these slides are put together as of yesterday was that some things will come out, the less tight, not the more tight, possibly even today. Because these would be market moving announcements related to the residual shares of the two GSEs that trade, means it would either be before market open, that didn't happen, or after 4 o'clock Eastern time, and we shall see. I personally expect a few modest things to be done. Next slide. Near and dear to your hearts, uncertainty about multifamily caps. The cap regime, and I'm going to keep a little high level here, multifamily cap regime began in 2013 when Ed DeMarco, the acting director, a professional civil servant who ended up being the acting director for 4 years, had a conservative bias to help try to shrink the footprint. And in that logic, while single family's business regarded as more core to the market, the issue is, why are the GSEs doing so much of a share of business for the multifamily business? Doesn't the private sector really take care of that? And so DeMarco put in a cap for the first year that was 10% below the prior year's level. That caused a lot of toing and froing in the industry. And the second year, although he originally said he would shrink it further, he kept it level. What happened was the industry was growing a lot, and the GSEs not being able to grow with it started to cause pressure, especially outside some of the more high-profile segments where the GSEs pay an even bigger market share, such as medium-sized deals or not the big urban fancy deals. Then we had Director Mel Watt, a liberal. He revised the whole cap regime and created uncapped categories for things that he regarded as having social value, the affordable categories, and even environmental, meaning green financing. And the cap was actually revised frequently, so it did not create shortages of capital during a big growth era. And so even sometimes quarterly adjustments with kind of a target market share of about 40% in mind. Director Calabria then came in early spring of 2019. As a conservative, he is more shrink the footprint oriented. He eliminated the environmental green financing. He put a single cap in, eliminating the uncapped affordable, so that would no longer grow uncontrollably in his perspective. And for the coming year, i.e. the one we're in now, he did his first overt shrinkage of 12.5% to 140 billion per annum, 70 for each company. Again, 12.5% over last year. And that the affordable share got up to be at least 50%. So what are the uncertainties when and if President Biden appoints an FHFA director? Assuming the most likely scenario that he does, at least on an acting basis, sometime in June or so, will the level of the cap be changed? Will the shrinkage be reversed? Will it be made higher? No one knows, but likely it certainly will not be shrunk anymore. Will the share required to be affordable decrease, increase, or become uncapped? Nobody knows. It all depends on who that person is and directions given to them. I would be surprised if it doesn't get changed in some fashion, but I think it's between some kind of increase or uncapped. With the environmental category return, the Biden administration has made a big deal about greenhouse gases and energy efficiency and such. They would be sympathetic to this. But the FHFA as a housing organization actually did a very poor job of defining this last time around. So if it's going to come back, I would hope they would do it better. And I wrote down here, it depends upon private market vibrance. If the private market seems to be is leaving everyone gasping, there's not enough financing around, there'll be more pressure for the GSEs to do something. If the private market is hot and heavy and there's no shortages of capital, then maybe the GSE under a Biden person would not be so aggressive. Again, lots of uncertainty. Next slide, please. And generally about the Biden administration direction, there are a lot of things we don't know. In this country with a two-party system, every president, Republican or Democrat, has a wide tent between more moderate or more radical policies. In this case, the radical would be on the left because Biden is a Democrat. He's appointed officials from both kind of camps. We just don't know where housing will fit in this. Transition team or high-level statements have been too generic to reach any conclusions. They push two key words, affordability and promoting home ownership. That doesn't mean much. Then I remind everyone, personnel is policy. Who are they picking to be the key players? Do they have past statements in housing? Here we're left with not much in the way of substance. The people who have been picked, such as Janet Yellen as Secretary of Treasury, has no specific history related to housing or housing issues. The Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, ditto, and the woman rumored to be the key player, the Domestic Undersecretary, ditto. There's just not, housing is just one of many issues they have to deal with, and that's not one they have backgrounds in. Interest group pressures here are, it's Washington, it's election time of a new administration. So in this case, all the interest groups from the left are what I call wish list time. They basically go, dear Biden administration, here's everything I ever wanted, please give it to me, or some variation on that. And it lists so much, you just know these things don't happen. But they would like the GSEs to fund all sorts of programs with their profits so it doesn't show up in the taxpayer budget. They would like lower G fees. They would like expanded credit boxes. It's all the usual things. They're advocates advocate. They don't worry about the full picture. Eventually, the officials appointed will worry about the full picture, and we'll see what happens. My expectations, and I don't predict the future great, but here they go anyway. The GSEs, the Biden administration people will delay or certainly de-emphasize conservatorship exit. It is not a priority with them. And many Democrats are happy with how the GSEs have been operating under conservatorship, especially prior to Director Calabria's arrival. And so many of them are very happy for status quo. You have the potential restoration of multifamily cap to a higher level. What happens to the affordable subcategory or environmental? I just don't know. It's too uncertain. The Calabria capital rule, which would apply to the GSEs when they exited conservatorship, will be undoubtedly revised. Whether it goes to mainstream or permissive, meaning more like pre-2008, too low to match Calabria's too high, we don't know. I'm hoping for mainstream. I note that the FHFA under Director Watt developed a capital system for internal use of conservatorship to manage the companies that was very mainstream. And I would look for them to try to undo any FHFA lame duck, shrink the footprint actions. Some of those become public. I'm aware of some that are more private in terms of small tinkering to shrink the credit box. I would expect those things over time to get reversed in line with the Biden administration's general philosophies about government. So there you go. Next slide, please. That's the ending one, I believe. Yep.
Prior to jumping into that next slide, just a really quick clarification then. So a Calabria likely exit occurring mid-year 2021 means that we're probably all going to be living with the revised multifamily caps that came out in November or December for the remainder of 2021, most likely. And then the administrative change and a new FHFA director would most likely lead to a situation where maybe those caps go away in 2022 and going forward. Is that a layman's?
Yeah, I'm going to highlight the uncertainty. I believe that it would first be an acting director. An acting director might very well just undo the caps and put it back to a prior year as a simple fix for the rest of the year.
Okay.
But you won't find out until the summer when they arrive. I mentioned this personnel as policy. Without going into the details, the Biden administration would have a limited array of people to appoint as the acting director according to various laws. And if they pick one who is, if you will, a loyalist to the Biden administration, but has no housing background, a little bit more of a babysitter, then you wouldn't see a lot of action. If they pick someone who is more up on housing issues, like one of the existing deputy directors, then you could get fast action on many things because you have someone who's ready to hit the ground running. So it depends who they choose. I doubt the caps will go away. I doubt that because when Director Watt came in as a very liberal Democrat, he kept them. He just managed them differently to fit more of a liberal philosophy. You would have to be even more motivated to be expansionist than Mel Watt would be to kind of take them off entirely. The reason why it's tough to take them off entirely is because in conservatorship, there's no ROE requirement. There's no stock options. There's no bonuses tied to P&Ls. It is conservatorship. So the tendency there, if you have no caps, would be for the GSEs to compete for market share by cutting price, and that would be considered poor government policy.
Appreciate the thoughts.
Okay. So with my last slide, again, it is a time of peak uncertainty that leaves us all bereft of what we need to plan business actions. But the GSEs have been, for a long time, so politicized. We all know that housing finance in general in this country is politicized. I will use the single family statistics between the GSEs and the FHFA. 2/3 of the mortgages in this country end up in government hands. On the multifamily side, the number, you got to throw in some other FHA, it's about half. This means government is in the shorts of housing finance in a heavy way. That means politics is in it. And so when there's heavy uncertainty in the political side, there's heavy uncertainty in housing finance. The two go hand in hand. And that's where we are today. Hopefully by the second half of this year, this time of peak uncertainty will have passed and we'll be on a new path under a Biden administration. And that's it. And I'm ready to go to Q&A.
Great, Don. Thank you very much. We do have a number of questions that have come in. So I'll start here. The first one really goes back to one of your early slides where you were talking about how much of the multifamily and single family business Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae finance. So the specific question is, you reference that the agencies finance 45% of single family and 40% of multifamily. Availability of attractive loan terms has to support the values of those properties. And have you ever seen an estimate of how much value was attributable to the agency financing that's available?
I don't recall ever seeing an estimate like that. The statistics that were developed by think tanks, not just by Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae, is that it was usually more less assumption dependent than that kind of calculation would be. And so they were much more of what percentage of properties were financed, with a specific focus on what percentage of them were affordable at 60%, 80%, 100% of AMI, because that's your basic government measure of the social value, those kind of mortgages. And so it was all more oriented that way. Also, how big a role it played in, I'll say, less mainstream types of multifamily where the banks and insurance companies play heavily. So looking at your typical smaller city or your more rural properties, much more, they played a role. The GSEs play a much smaller role in what I'll call the showy, big city properties where banks and insurance companies have a bigger market share. So it was all oriented towards the social value, not the economic value to the industry.
Great, thank you. Next question we have that's come in here is talking about the footprint and whether we're in a growing or a shrinking footprint environment. So in general, what are those conversations like when you were at Freddie Mac with the regulator about trying to figure out where an annual cap might be for production?
I will give you the caveat. I left just as Calabria was arriving. So my experiences are with Mel Watt and Ed DeMarco. I will give you that by general reputation, Messrs. DeMarco and Watt acted within what I'll call a mainstream view of what a professional regulator is. That was unusual for Mel Watt because he'd been a very liberal 20-year congressman, but he got up and said, I know the difference between being a professional regulator and being an elected representative of a constituency, and he behaved that way. So the discussions, while they had their policy viewpoint conservative on Ed's part and liberal on Mel's, they were basic conversations about market share, market stresses, the social value, what we could do. Again, it wasn't about the industry making money. It's the social value, what we could do to keep housing going. By background, in that era, housing shortages have been here for all that time. Rents going up, especially starting in about 2014-15, faster than usual household incomes. And so there was a backdrop of an affordability crisis building on the rental side in particular, which I think is still true. And so there was, if you will, especially under Director Watt, a predisposition to make sure the market did not feel shortage of financing stressed between the GSEs and other sources. Let me use an analogy. They talk about Saudi Arabia being the swing source of oil in the world to make the balance and prices go up or down. In this view, the GSEs were a bit of the swing source. If the market needed more help to keep an equilibrium and normal financing going, then we would grow. If it didn't, we didn't have to grow as much. So it's a very rational discussion. I haven't been there for Director Calabria's discussions. All we know is what he's done, and that he has a conservative background, which eventually showed up in the 12.5% footprint reduction cap for this year. You folks would know better than I do how much stress that is causing the market or not.
Well, it hadn't fully hit yet, but we do have some other questions that have come in about those specific caps and Director Calabria's policy leanings there. Specifically, there's a question here about the focus shifting to 60% of AMI and away from some of the higher cost markets, where it might make Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac less competitive in those markets because of not getting mission credit there. What are your thoughts about the policy that's come out here in the last 60 days or so that really shifts Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to more of the 60% or 80% markets?
I learned in my years at Freddie, and first of all, for DJ and Jeff, I'm going to have to teach you how to say Freddie and Fannie instead of Fannie and Freddie. I learned the nuances and how in a big expensive city, to help the people you were really intended to help, you maybe even have to go up to 120% of AMI, for example, in New York City, or you would literally be doing nothing. So I learned about getting away from, if you will, a single national average statistic, and you had to be a little more sensitive than that. I think Director Calabria's overall ideological bias towards shrinking the footprint shows up in his reducing the AMI definition as well, with the notion of you should be doing the most affordable, which may be true, but the reality is it means for a bigger swath of the market, the 80% of AMI, 100%, the GSEs won't be there. And that's a shrinking the footprint mentality that I think is dominant, and I don't think it went that much past that. So I regard it as a subset of the shrinking the footprint, and if you get someone in charge who is not about shrinking the footprint, then you'll have the definitions change.
We have some questions here that have come in about Go ahead.
Let me add one thing to that. The FHFA, while an independent agency, listens to all sorts of interest groups. You have many representatives in Washington for multifamily. They have to speak about these issues to influence the outcome. And my one piece of advice is they had better speak with one voice. If you're, in this case, a Director Calabria who wants to shrink, and one group comes in and says X, and one group comes in and says Y, and one group comes in and says Z, then he goes, I'm leaving it alone. If they all come in and say, I want B, then you get more possibility of influencing the outcome. And the industry doesn't always do a great job of speaking with one voice. You have so many different groups representing you.
Another question that's come in, a number of questions have come in about the COVID escrows that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. See, I did it in your right order there. The COVID escrows that the agencies have required since the start of the pandemic. Largely, we've seen Class B assets hold up really well. Do you think that we'll see any change in the near term for the requirement of the COVID escrows?
The answer is I'm going to pull the CEO card here and go, I have never focused on the specifics of that, so I have no opinion on the matter whatsoever. You got me too much details on that one.
It's a question we get asked every single day, so had to ask it.
Well, for Freddie, you can go ask Debbie. You know where she lives.
You talked about conservatorship, and you were there during conservatorship and trying to build a strong team at the agencies. How hard was it to attract top talent then? And one of the questions we've seen here is specifically you left, and then David Brickman came in behind you, and now David Brickman has now resigned to pursue other activities. So specifically citing David's departure, how hard is it to attract and retain top talent, especially since it looks like conservatorship will be a longer term proposition?
I will tell you that obviously it is a different scenario for attracting top talent than a typical for-profit corporation. It's a hybrid. It's part for-profit corporation, part agency. I was able to attract a senior team. I ended up with 10 direct reports at Freddie Mac, and 8 of them were outside hires over my first few years. So I and others were able to attract people. We sold ourselves not as a for-profit company temporarily in conservatorship. There's a subset of people who are happy to get decent compensation, which Freddie and Fannie people did get under, at least prior to Calabria, and to contribute to if you will, a public mission. There are people who are interested in doing that, because if you work at the GSEs, you get to swing a big stick in terms of reform. And we had an era of, I'll say, the golden era of reform was sort of around my time there, between DeMarco and Watt's attitudes and what we were able to propose and do. The GSEs probably improved their competitiveness and their commercialness more than ever. One of the strange conundrums was they ran better as corporations then than they did prior to conservatorship, because they were not involved anymore in lobbying for subsidies and things. You were strictly involved in commercial activities. But you have to search hard to find people like that. We did, but it's a struggle. Director Calabria's policy direction has made it harder. Because of the more micromanagement style, so you can't talk about being able to do new things and innovate, because innovation is not a priority. His priority was conservatorship exit. Now, you would have thought a lot of people would have been interested in joining to get in on the ground floor conservatorship exit, but I think a lot of people saw through, if you will, the PR campaign about this or the media push about this, like it's going to happen tomorrow, when it's not really going to. There's just too much wood to chop, especially by Treasury. So it's become harder to retain executives. Whether they'll be hard to replace, I suspect they will, but we will find out. It's just an unusual situation. And every bit of the instability I talked about in my slideshow for businesses for planning is true for joining it. If you don't know where it's going, how can you say, I'm interested in joining? Because you don't know where that ship is heading. So I'm hoping that when stability of direction is reestablished, call it what, a year from now, 9 months from now, then the management teams will be able to attract a talent better.
Hey, Don, I want to ask a question about innovation, and specifically as it pertains to Freddie Mac and multifamily. A few years back, we saw a lot of innovation starting to come out of Freddie Mac, especially as you develop products and use of your balance sheet, right? There was talk of construction lending. There was a mezzanine product that was kicked around to support affordable housing. There was the mod rehab product. That all kind of went away a year and a half ago as the focus shifted to building the balance sheet and exiting conservatorship. Is the innovation something that you're hopeful will come back with Freddie Mac?
There are two themes of why innovation has slowed up. And by the way, yes, when David Brickman was running multifamily before he was promoted to president, he's Mr. Innovation. They were looking to a lot of things within the rules. The FHFA said yes to some of them. The FHFA said no to others as being a bridge too far, but enough came out that it clearly was trying to do a better job, and very much a focus again on those things with high social value, as opposed to just make a buck. Two things mitigate against this. One, of course, is Director Calabria, with his perspective, is not very much pro GSE innovation. That's expanding the footprint almost by definition, and he's a shrink the footprint person, so he's not positively disposed. But this builds on a base, and the base is, if you will, the Washington involvement with the GSEs. There's a running line that one person's innovation or efficiency is another person's loss of revenue. And so there has been some time pushback by special interest groups in housing finance that have high margins due to old-fashioned business models, being wary of any GSE innovation that might make the market more efficient and cost them some of their margin. So they have lobbied for a long time and got in legislation a notion that the GSE should be like a government agency when it comes to new things, and treat it like a new rule in the legal sense of a government rule, and have to go through a notice period, an announcement, and public comment before it could be done. That obviously is a government agency mentality, not a shareholder-owned corporation mentality. And Director Calabria has grabbed onto that and is looking to put a rule in requiring that, which not only will slow things up, but allows every special interest who lives off of inefficiency to try to stop an innovation that might cost them $1 or $2. That's Washington. That's why people don't like a lot of the swampiness in Washington. For GSE, where you have government support, it's a tougher issue to balance out. But right now, the balance is going very heavy into anti-innovation, in my view, and needs to be reestablished as a balance.
Don, one of the questions we have here that has come in really ties into that. Do you expect to see more of a progressive approach under a Biden administration where you have a much more active involvement of the agencies in housing and housing finance?
I certainly know there will be a push by many progressive groups to do just that. In a top level issue view of housing finance, the GSEs represent a source of funding for projects and implementation for projects to do progressive things that does not have to go through the federal budget process, where things are tough to get it on the budget because you're dealing with scarce dollars. You can put it as a burden on the GSEs, then why not? And they will spend their profits doing it. That is a long time trend, and it's was kept to a dull roar during most of conservatorship, but it is back. When the GSEs had no retained earnings and all the money was going to Treasury, needless to say, the argument didn't have a lot of merit to take and do things because it was taxpayer money, obviously. Now that the GSEs are retaining earnings again, you have the politics where why not spend some of their money and they'll make it up somehow else. So there's just a lot of, I've mentioned the wish list, a lot of the wish list items would have the GSEs do many things or fund many things. Again, off the budget is politically easier to get than on budget. How many of these things will actually make it through the traps to become real? That's the uncertainty. Depends who the director is, what the policies are, whether it's more moderates or more radicals. We shall see.
We have a question here about one of the topics you touched on earlier on in the call, and that's about the credit risk transfer tools that Freddie Mac has come up with. Do you think that Calabria views Freddie Mac's credit risk transfer as a better use of government dollars than he does the Fannie Mae credit risk transfer tool?
Okay, I assume you're talking multifamily rather than single
Yes,
family.
yes, definitely.
I have never heard or indirectly or heard of Mark Calabria commenting on credit risk transfer in multifamily as opposed to single family. The focus was totally on single family, and I'm not aware of his views on the matter. I will tell you that going into Calabria's regime, just to get everybody in the same page, Freddie Mac's K-deal structure takes and eliminates on a credit risk a capital behind credit risk basis, about 90% of the capital in credit risk. Fannie Mae, as everyone knows, had its longtime DUS structure, which was not really originally a credit risk transfer structure. It was an alignment of interest structure, so that a lender and Fannie would, the lender would not be trying to dump the losses on Fannie, but would have skin in the game as well. And only later was it called credit risk transfer, but it of course was limited. On average, I think it was 28% of the capital was back on the original lender. And then the FHFA required Fannie to go higher than that, having Freddie up at 80, 90%, and Fannie at 28, 30%, they just couldn't take it after a while. So they forced Fannie to do things beyond us, and they started doing back-end transactions of various types and starting to run that percentage up, again, to meet FHFA requirements. They're still in place, but I just don't know if it's gotten a big level view by Calabria as opposed to being on autopilot. I will tell you that in most cases, for most people and Democrats, and actually most Republicans, are very favorable to credit risk transfer. They like the idea of the taxpayer being less on the hook as they back the companies. So I would expect pressure on Fannie to continue by a new Biden person to run that percentage up, just like it was under Director Watt.
Last couple of questions that we have here to share. What is your view of the power of the GSEs to provide stability to the CRE financing markets? And why don't we hear more about the good work that Freddie and Fannie are doing to support CRE financing, especially during times like we've experienced over the last 12 months?
Okay, well, one of the aspects of conservatorship, everybody, is you're not allowed to lobby. You're not allowed to take out, if you will, bragging ads. You're not allowed to market. Look at all the good stuff we've done. You can sort of make speeches saying it once in a while. But if you will, the usual toolkit companies would have to do that is prohibited to them. So if there's any, if you will, making it known, it's going to have to be done by the industry or the government itself via speeches and such. So in the toing and froing Washington, the GSEs have one hand tied behind their backs and letting people know what they're doing because they're not allowed to use all these channels. The GSEs are a source of stability, and they should be. I think everybody here knows that at least for the first few months of the pandemic, a lot of private capital sources, given the uncertainty, ran for the hills. The GSEs did not. They're not supposed to. They are given privileges, by the way, to make it easier for them to not run for the hills. So it all kind of fits. And they played that role wonderfully. I will tell you that at least on the single family side, which plays a bigger weight in the politics in Washington, everybody noticed very, very much that at least in conservatorship, the GSEs stayed, they didn't run, they provided the stability, they helped the economy come back, and that, quote, if they'd been privatized or they've acted like banks, that wouldn't have been true. That's an opinion on their part. I'm not sure about that. So it has been noticed to a degree, but it's not because the companies are doing anything to make it known. They're not allowed to.
Appreciate it, Don. Last question, just for any of our senior housing or student housing friends on the call. As it pertains to capital allocation towards those asset classes, how did those discussions go inside of Freddie Mac?
Yeah. I think capital allocation as a phrase is not what's going on here. This was not in conservatorship a notion of you have a limited amount of capital, where should we put it? You get 10%, you get 20 here. That is not the way it worked. It was, that implies a limited pool of capital and you have to divide it up. In reality, part of that stability that you're supposed to have as a GSE is, it's what was the returns? Were they attractive? Keep doing it. And if all were attractive because the market was stressed and prices were high, just keep doing it. You're supposed to keep the market stable by growing. If they were unattractive because the market already is overfinanced, then withdraw in general. It was more a if there's a demand here and the GSEs need to have a role to keep the demand met with unreasonable terms, go for it.
Got it.
Okay.
Well, I think we're running out of time here. I wanted to, first of all, sincerely thank you for your time and your insights. They were extremely helpful. To our clients that joined us, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of your time as well. And personally, I just want to say I find it quite unnatural to talk to a computer camera. So I appreciate everybody bearing with me as I open this up. But we will be posting this on YouTube, and we will be setting this to registers as well in case anybody wants to view it again. So thanks so much, Don. Thank you everybody that participated, and we will see you all soon.
Okay. Thank you, DJ. Thank you, everyone.